As the children head back to school this week in various ways and in different settings, it gives us a chance to remember that maybe the teachers we had ourselves. You might remember some of the teachers' names or the principals. We're asking, did you remember the custodians? Can you name a teacher's assistant or those wonderful people, the supply teachers? I think this year, after the summer of Black Lives Matter, and more Black and racialized Canadians seeking racial justice, teachers and families will be asked more questions about some of the big stories they might have heard referred to, especially the sermons, still so powerful decades later, of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, Martin Luther King used the images of Moses over and over again, the liberator, as his inspiration, an inspiring vision for people long oppressed here, as the Israelites had been so long ago there. And so today, this morning here in downtown Victoria, we look back at that original story, and we've heard from a beautiful presentation to the children about the birth of Moses, and then David read us the actual story from the Torah. And David started in chapter 1. And it's not till chapter 2 that we actually meet Moses, who will be the strong deliverer of the ancient nation. But in chapter 1, we have met some strong deliverers that maybe don't always get included in the story. But what we heard was when the Pharaoh commanded the nations and told the Hebrew midwives to kill, it is significant that the only people named in chapter 1 are those two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. The Pharaoh is not named. Now, it may be that people assumed you'd know the name, just like many people today know Queen means Queen Elizabeth II because she's been our queen for so long. But it may be that Torah wanted to focus our attention, and the narrator wanted to focus our attention not on the man who wanted to kill the babies and lie to their mothers, because his power must have seemed limitless, whether or not we knew his name. But the narrator is focusing our attention on those two, it seems, powerless, unimportant, social, low-caste midwives, Puah and Shiphrah. They are virtually powerless, let's never forget that, except for their faith in God. So there are some very important questions for us about these two women. I wonder how you picture them in your minds. Do you see them almost like nurses? Do you see them like doctors? Like your aunts? Like your mom? One of the questions about is what nationality were these two women? And this is a very, very important question, which the Hebrew itself, thousands of years old, does not clarify for us. So there are two possible interpretations of those words in ancient Hebrew. It could be that they are Israelite midwives, or it could be, equally possible, they are the midwives to the Israelites. On one hand, they are Israelite themselves, but on the other, they would be Egyptian women working as a midwife to the Israelites. That is a huge difference for us to think about. Today, I want to think about the threads from that story that are still knit into the fabric of our moral beings today. And either way, there are important threads being created by those two women. So I wanted to just work a little while and pull those threads forward. Because the Hebrew isn't clear, I think it's worthwhile just for a moment to think, well, what difference does it make? What nationality they were? So the Pharaoh, as we've heard, and as we know from history, had a murderous plan. Wily involves the midwives, using those very low-caste women. He knows, they know, the world of that day knew he was able to afflict an entire nation if that was his decision. He had such power. And so it would make sense, whatever their nationality, for the midwives to do exactly what he told them to do, wouldn't it? But they stood up to the Pharaoh. There's no way else to say it. They were the resistance movement behind the lines. They were the undetected agents in that ancient story. The Torah does tell us that their faith gave them the strength to save the babies, that's one thing, but then to lie face to face when confronted by the Pharaoh. It's amazing. So there are those two different traditional ways of reading the story of Shiphrah and Puah. In the first read, they themselves are Israelite women, and that's legitimately taken from the Hebrew. So Shiphrah and Puah are Israelites. They are working with the women of their own community. Perhaps we could even see them occasionally working with cousins or sisters or people of their place. So they're standing up to the Pharaoh for their family. They're standing up for their friends, for the people with whom they have shared so much faith in a time of captivity in Egypt. The confusing part of seeing them as Israelite is, why would Pharaoh have thought they would actually do his plan at all? Of course, the most obvious reason is his power. He assumes that everybody's afraid of him, and why wouldn't he? I'm sure that the vast majority think that his power is so strong there is no point to even dream of acting against him, to even strategize for ways around his murder. But so he would be understood easily, wouldn't it, if the Pharaoh just said, of course everybody's afraid, but they're going to do whatever I ask. If I ask them to kill their sister's children, they're going to do it. It's me doing the asking. That's a pretty clear reason. I can see that if you were Pharaoh or one of his supporters, you wouldn't believe that the midwives of all people would take a stand for what they believe is right, for these lives of infants, little tiny babies. And another honest reckoning would be that traditionally, the Israelites don't have always the reputation of being the most protective of their own people. You remember that the reason why they are in Egypt in the first place is because Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, remember, for 20 pieces of silver? That's how this particular story started. So maybe Pharaoh or his henchmen, his planners, figure that this is a people who won't look out for each other, so it'll be fine to tell the Israelite women to murder these children, because really we know from history that they're likely to do that. I think that's a possible interpretation. The whole second way of reading the story, though, is that, and the Hebrew introduces us to this as a possibility, that they themselves, Puah and Shiphrah, are Egyptian women, whose job it is simply to help the Israelite women give birth. And then, as the Pharaoh got more angry at the Israelites and more concerned about their numbers, the job description changed and grew and included this new element of only letting the baby girls live. In some ways, this reading of the story makes a lot more sense because, of course, the Pharaoh would assume that fellow Egyptian women would kill the babies of the Israelites because they too would be fearful, they too would be angry, like him. They would be reacting to the Israelites like him. And so they would be willing to carry out his orders and kill them just like the rest of Egypt, according to Pharaoh's logic. Well, the midwives should be so afraid of him that he's right. Let's understand that. They should be willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that they are alive by going along with his control. In this reading of the story, Shiphrah and Puah, act of resistance is a little less obvious, but even more important. Feel the thread of that resistance coming, to be told by someone who shares your ethnicity, shares your home group, to murder these babies, and to say to your best friend, your coworker, Shiphrah, are we going to do it? Are we actually going to do that? Or do you imagine, could we let the babies live? It's scary, isn't it, just to imagine it? Think of the power of the Pharaoh. But what if we let the little boys live? What if we came up with the story that those Israelite women are so fast giving birth we couldn't get there in time? Because the Pharaoh hates the Israelites so much, he's willing to believe anything they tell him. Because it would not strike the Pharaoh as obvious that anybody was going against his will and letting those little babies live. So with a straight face and probably trembling hands, they tell him, no, their labor is so short. You wouldn't believe how quickly they have their babies. We don't even get there. And they've gone home. The babies are alive. So the taskmasters, they went along with the Pharaoh. Those people we heard about with the shipyard, with the brickyards, they went along with the Pharaoh. But here are these two women plotting together with a little bit of power they've got, coming up with this unbelievable plan. We'll lie to the Pharaoh and we'll let those babies live. Now, if they're Egyptians, that's extraordinarily strong. And you might think, well, that's very unusual. That's not such a big thread, Sheila, to be carrying full as part of our moral fabric. And then we meet the Pharaoh's daughter, who, one would imagine, when she sees the baby, I'm looking for the children's story, when she sees the baby in the basket and thinks this is probably an Israelite, shouldn't she just flip the basket? Shouldn't she just watch the baby gurgle and drown? I mean, that would be a legitimate response, wouldn't it? The Pharaoh's daughter. But instead, feel the thread of justice seeking come through this. Feel the thread of rebellion, the thread of using whatever power you've got. And she has compassion. She says to her maid, as we've heard, find somebody who can nurse this baby. I've decided to spare his life. Wait a minute. Now we have 3 Egyptian women acting against the Pharaoh. Our thread is getting stronger. 3 is a braid, isn't it? Stronger. 3 acting on behalf of the powerless women, exhausted from giving birth. They are willing to take chances with their lives rather than to go against their consciences. And those very different threads, if they're Israelites or if they're Egyptian, give us 2 beautiful examples and stories to think about. What power have we got to stand up to evil? What power have we got, whatever the situation? Were they Israelite women willing to stand up for the community? Who in our community is hoping it will stand up for them? Or are they Egyptians standing up for people who are different? What other people are looking to us, maybe as Christians or people from British Columbia or Canadians, to use our voice, whatever power we've got, to stand up in their situation? Those people, those children of Pharaoh's daughter, those children of Shiphrah and Puah, they're waiting to hear from us. Either way, we understand it. We're left with a strong braid of individual action resulting in the survival of Moses. The survival of Moses results in the liberation of the people of the Hebrew people. The small act leads to something that is world-changing. Still celebrated, still powerful, still inspirational today in 2020. So we peel our way back to the 2 women there beside the water with the baby, making it possible for all of this story to unfold. And that thread That thread is enough for a whole blanket to keep us warm as we make our own difficult moral chances. This is the school that our Torah, our Bible, our faith provides for us. Thanks be to God.